As promised, I am reading Mickey's Christmas Carol. It was Christmas Eve and Ebenezer Scrooge was rushing through snowy London. Scrooge didn't like Christmas and he didn't believe in helping the poor. He barged past carolers and wouldn't give a penny to anyone. Even when Scrooge's nephew, Fred, stopped by his office shouting, "Merry Christmas, Uncle Scrooge," Scrooge kicked him out. A while later, Scrooge's assistant, Bob Cratchit, stepped down from his stool to go home. "I suppose you'll be wanting tomorrow off," Scrooge barked, "but to be here all the earlier the next day." "Thank you, Mr. Scrooge," cried Bob. "Merry Christmas," he called as he went. "Bah, humbug," muttered Scrooge. Later that night, Scrooge locked up his office and went home. As he went to open the front door, Scrooge took a closer look at his door knocker. He gasped. On the knocker was the face of his old business partner, Jacob Marley. The face began to move and softly called, "Scrooge." Frightened, Scrooge raced aside, but soon enough the ghost of his former partner appeared in front of him, chains circling his body. "Tonight you'll be visited by 3 spirits," boomed Marley. "Listen to them, do what they say, or your chains will be heavier than mine. Farewell, Ebenezer." Scrooge went to bed, but not long later he was awoken by a little figure in a top hat. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," he told Scrooge. "You must come with me." But Scrooge laughed. "Look how small you are. Go away." "Silence," ordered the spirit. "If men were measured by kindness, you would be smaller than a grain of sand. We are going back in time when Christmas was not humbug." The spirit commanded Scrooge grab hold of his coat-tails, and remembering Marley's terrible warning, he held on. The windows flew open instantly. They were soaring over rooftops and chimneys. The spirit's little umbrella kept them aloft. Soon they landed outside a brightly lit house. Joyful Christmas music filled the air. Peering through the windows, Scrooge couldn't believe his eyes. "Why, it's Isabel!" he cried, suddenly remembering the girl who he had once loved. But who's she dancing so merrily with? "That man was you, Scrooge," replied the spirit, "in the days when you, too, were kind and cheerful." Then the spirit whisked Scrooge away to another scene. Inside, Scrooge of many years before sat behind a desk covered in money. Isabel stood in front of him, tears in his eyes. "Why is Isabel crying?" asked Scrooge. Then he remembered he had taken Isabel's home from her when she could not pay her bills and refused to marry her. Suddenly Scrooge found himself back in bed. He thought it had been a dream. Then his thoughts turned to Isabel and how his chance of happiness with her had been ruined by his love of money. Scrooge put his head down and sobbed into his pillow. As he cried, Scrooge felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He sat up, and beside his bed was a fierce-looking giant feasting. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," he boomed. "There's no time to lose." And with that, the spirit picked Scrooge up and put him in his pocket. He then pushed open the roof and stepped outside as though from a doll's house. Scrooge peeked out of the giant's pocket. "I wonder where we're going," he said to himself. Pulling Scrooge from his pocket, the spirit tore a lamppost from the ground to use as a lantern as he walked through the streets. Soon they arrived at a tiny run-down house. "What a dreadful little house!" Scrooge exclaimed. "Who could live in such a place? Perhaps a miserable beggar." "Look closer, Scrooge, and tell me who you see," said the spirit. Scrooge pressed his face against the glass for a better look. "Why, it's Bob Cratchit, my clerk," he said with surprise. "Does he live here?" The spirit scowled. "Look at how he lives, thanks to your generosity. Look at the food his family must eat on Christmas Eve, all because they can afford." The hungry Cratchit family sat at the table, but to carve up the smallest goose Scrooge had never seen. Scrooge watched a boy named Tiny Tim hobble into the room, leaning on a little crutch. He gave thanks to Scrooge for the meal, and Scrooge felt ashamed. "Tell me, spirit, what's wrong with that lad?" asked Scrooge. "Much, I'm afraid," the spirit replied. "If these shadows remain unchanged, I see an empty chair where Tiny Tim once sat." Suddenly the scene went dark as Scrooge was alone, church bells tolling in the distance. Just then, a swirling smoke engulfed Scrooge, growing thicker and thicker until he couldn't see anything around him. The smoke blew into his nose and he coughed. As the smoke lifted, Scrooge found himself standing in a graveyard. There were tombstones everywhere, covered by snow. Scrooge looked up to find him no longer alone. A horrible shadow, his face hidden inside a cloak, stood silently before him. "Are you the ghost of Christmas future?" stammered Scrooge. "Tell me what will happen to Tiny Tim." The spirit just looked at Scrooge, then raised his arm to point to something in the distance. Scrooge looked up where the spirit was pointing and saw Bob Cratchit and his family gathering around a tombstone. Bob knelt before a little gravestone, tears rolling down his face, and gently laid Tiny Tim's crutch on top. "Oh no," Scrooge cried. "Spirit, I don't want this to happen. Tell me these events can yet be changed." Scrooge noticed two gravediggers finishing a fresh grave. "I've never seen a funeral like this," one of them. "No mourners, no friends to bid him farewell." Scrooge peered into the grave and asked the spirit who it belonged to. "Why, it's yours, Ebenezer." The spirit laughed as his hood fell from his face. "No, I'll change," cried Scrooge. The grave burst into flames and the spirits pushed him in. "Let me out," screamed Scrooge. "Let me!" Suddenly a bell tolled, and as Scrooge opened his eyes, he cried with joy. He was back in his bedroom. "It's Christmas morning!" he exclaimed. He threw on his coat and hat and raced for the door. He ran out onto the street calling "Merry Christmas" to everyone he met. He gave two men a bag of coins each, who stood there speechless, wondering what had changed in grumpy old Scrooge. Scrooge even stopped his nephew when he saw him approaching in a wagon. Fred was so surprised by his uncle's cheerfulness that he almost fell off his carriage. Waving goodbye to his nephew, Scrooge continued on his way to Bob Cratchit's house. Rat-tat! Scrooge knocked on his employer's door. Bob opened the door and his face fell when he saw who it was. "Why, Mr. Scrooge, Merry Christmas, won't you come in?" he said. Scrooge stomped inside and dropped a heavy sack on the floor. Scrooge then broke into a massive smile and told Bob he was getting a pay rise and he bought food and toys for his family. Bob Cratchit couldn't believe it. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Scrooge." "Merry Christmas, Bob," Scrooge said as the whole family danced for joy. "It was a Christmas miracle. God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim.